Everyone. Today we're going to be talking about nitrogen management in humid temperate climates. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention that we do get federal funding and our programs are open and accessible to everyone. So I wanted to start by kind of the big picture here. Why do we care about nitrogen management? Because if nitrogen is not used by our crops, then that's money that's lost for farmers, and it can also lead to environmental problems. So kind of there's two issues we're dealing with, both important. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is in regards to row crops or grain crops, but the principles really apply to all different types of cropping systems. So it's going to be a pretty basic overview, but just kind of getting us back to the basics of the nitrogen cycle, and in particular, why some of the processes of the nitrogen cycle are so critical in our region in the humid temperate climate of the mid-Atlantic United States. So here is a figure of the nitrogen cycle, and don't worry, we're going to walk through this a lot during the presentation today, but we're basically what I wanted to point out here is several things. First of all, it's really complicated. There are arrows everywhere. So if you looked at some of the other cycles like phosphorus or potassium, you're not going to have nearly as many processes and arrows going everywhere in all different directions. Nitrogen cycle is really complicated, and it can be found in both the gas, the liquid, and the solid forms. So nitrogen can be in all three of those states. So if we just walk through a few of the processes here, if we have organic matter, that contains a % of nitrogen. So that's called organic nitrogen. And then that breaks down through mineralization. So the term mineralization means basically from starting in an organic form and then becoming mineral forms. So that's going to first, and it's done by bacteria. So it's bacterial processes. And that's first going to, the bacteria first going to convert the organic nitrogen to ammonium, and then a different type of bacteria will quickly convert that to nitrite and then nitrate. So, but both ammonium and nitrate are your mineral forms of nitrogen. And then the plants can take up, they can actually take up all three of those forms of nitrogen. So they can take up soluble organic nitrogen, they can take up ammonium. Actually, ammonium is the form that plants use, and they can take up nitrate. So plants are able to take up all of those forms of nitrogen, but the issue is that a lot of other things can happen in the meantime before the plant gets a chance to take up that nitrogen. So what we're going to be talking about today is how to optimize that nitrogen use for the plant and allow the plant to get as much as possible of that nitrogen rather than the nitrogen being lost through these other pathways. So some of the other pathways that I'm talking about, if we look at the form nitrate here, which is nitrogen plus 3 oxygens, and it's negatively charged, that can be lost really easily through leaching or rain going down through the soil. So we have, that is a big risk for loss of nitrate. If we have the ammonium form, that can be lost through volatilization. You could see here this green arrow, and become a gas. So ammonium can be converted to ammonia gas and be lost as a gas. If we have nitrate, not only can it be leached in that liquid form, it's soluble, it can also be denitrified and be lost as a gas. So nitrogen N2 gas or N2O gas or NO gas. So we could lose the nitrate both through leaching or as a gas. The ammonium form can be lost as a gas. The organic can even be lost through leaching. So we have a lot of loss pathways here. The other thing that can happen is even if we have nitrogen in these desirable forms that can be taken up by plants, we want to ensure that it's our crops that are taking up that nitrogen. We don't want the weeds to take up that nitrogen because that's essentially lost from the system. We also don't want, if we're trying to feed our crops, we also don't want that nitrogen to be taken up by soil organisms. So that is called immobilization, when we have nitrogen in a usable form, but instead of it being taken up by the crop, it gets converted back into an organic form through immobilization. So sometimes you'll hear about that with like a cover crop that has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio, a lot of carbon compared to the nitrogen. Well, the bacteria in that soil, they will eat up that nitrogen and prevent the plant from getting it. So that's called immobilizing that nitrogen. So we'll come back to this diagram and these different processes, but now I'm going to kind of shift gears to talk about what we could do to try to retain that nitrogen in our system and prevent it from being lost through those different pathways. So I'm sure everybody has heard about the 4R principles of nutrient stewardship, and this can apply to different nutrients, but we're going to talk about it in terms of nitrogen today. So the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. So if we think about our nitrogen in our system in terms of those 4 things and try to optimize those 4 things, then in the end, we're going to have more of the nitrogen in the system being fed to our plants or our crops. So the right source has to do with the type of fertilizer or nitrogen fertilizer that's being used. So there's different forms of nitrogen. It can be added in the form of manure, compost, crop residues, or your mineral or inorganic forms like your anhydrous ammonia or your UAN or your urea fertilizers, all different forms of nitrogen fertilizers. So the right source we want to think about in terms of the differences between those different sources of nitrogen. Your manure and compost and crop residues, they are all going to release nitrogen, but it's going to be a slower process. It's dependent on decomposition, and that so the organic materials have to decompose, and part of that is the organic nitrogen being broken down into those mineral forms, the nitrate or the ammonia that can then be taken up. So that's going to be a lot slower process. If your crop needs the nitrogen right now, you probably aren't going to want to apply manure because that's going to take longer to break down. You might want to apply a mineral form that'll be available immediately. The right rate, we want to match the amount of fertilizer to the crop needs. So we want to consider all of the nutrients that are being supplied from different sources. So if we are growing a corn crop, we don't want to assume that we need to add all of the nitrogen that that corn crop needs, because we may already have some in the field in organic forms. So if there was a cover crop, like a legume cover crop that was previously grown, are we considering the nitrogen that's available from that legume? And then we want to assess the plant demand. So how much does that plant actually need of nitrogen? Some crops are much heavier nitrogen feeders than others. And then we want to predict the efficiency of the nutrient sources. So again, this kind of gets down to how quickly do these nitrogen sources break down and actually release nitrogen in available forms. Of course, we want to do soil tests, although that one doesn't really apply as much to nitrogen because nitrogen is so variable. So unless you pay extra money to get a complete nutrient analysis, your basic soil test is not even going to tell you how much nitrogen is in your system because it does shift so quickly and so much. And we'll talk about this later, but for example, if you have nitrogen on the soil surface in the fall after growing a crop, that nitrogen in our region and our climate, that's going to be 3 feet deep by the spring. So if we're getting a soil test in the fall, it's not going to be indicative of how much nitrogen is there in the spring. And then we want to be sure we have reasonable yield targets. We don't want, if we know we're going to get 150 bushel per acre corn, we don't want to fertilize thinking that, oh, maybe this year we'll get 300 bushels per acre. The right time, we're going to have several examples talking about that. So we want nutrients to be available when the crop is actually going to be taking them up. We want that system to be really tight. So because it is so leaky, so we want this organic nitrogen to be broken into the ammonium and then the nitrate right when the plant needs to take up that nitrate, so that the plant will be able to take it up before it leaches away or turns or denitrifies and turns into gas. And then the right place. So it's important that we consider that nutrients are actually being placed where the crop can use them. And like I mentioned in the nitrogen cycle, we don't want the weeds to be taking up our nitrogen. We want our crop to be taking up the nitrogen. So the closer we could put that to where the crop is going to actually be able to access it and take it up and not the weeds, the more efficient we're going to be in terms of our nitrogen use. Precision agriculture is a really valuable tool that is becoming more popular now, where we could actually do variable rate applications of different nutrients exactly where the crop needs it. And then we want to recognize crop rooting patterns. How deep are the roots of this crop typically able to go to access nitrogen? Tillage can really interact with the placement of nutrients. So are we in a no-till system or a tillage system? And that is going to affect how we're going to place our nutrients. So moving on now into a few examples. So the first one I'm going to be talking about is side dressing corn. And this really gets to that 4R of the right time. So we want to apply the nitrogen to corn at the side dress time, which is when the corn is about 10 to 20 inches tall, because that's when the most growth is going to be happening in that corn plant, and it's going to be taking up the most nitrogen. And again, the leaching of nitrate out of the root zone and denitrification are real concerns. And if you think about it right now, I don't know where everybody's located, but we're getting some rain today. The corn has been planted on a lot of fields, but it's not yet at that side dress time. So nitrogen that was put out at planting, with the rain events that we typically get in the spring, that is really at risk to be lost through the denitrification into gas or through the leaching before the corn can take it up, because it's not yet in that rapid growth stage. And here's just another figure that I like, which this is showing how nitrogen is taken up and kind of moved around within a corn plant. So here we could see, like, if that's planting the corn, we have very little nitrogen uptake at the beginning of the season, and then you have this rapid growth period. So you actually have more than 7 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day for 21 days, right around that side dress time where it's recommended that we apply most of our nitrogen fertilizer for corn. So you have that very rapid growth. But then the interesting thing is, after that period, even though the corn plant continues growing all the way well into the summer, after that point, a lot of the nitrogen is just kind of moving around within the plant, and the actual uptake from the soil is not very much. So you could see that all this nitrogen that was taken up is actually just being remobilized from the leaf and the stalk into this blue area, which represents the grain. So the nitrogen is just moving around within the plant, but the plant is not taking that much more up out of the soil. So whenever the plant is not taking the nitrogen out of the soil, then that nitrogen is at greater risk to be lost through the leaching or through the different processes that turn it into a gas. So this is kind of showing you the value of the side dressing the nitrogen. So if this was all of the nitrogen being applied at pre-plant, you could see how much is vulnerable to be lost to leaching, versus if the bulk of nitrogen is being applied as side dress, you have much less being vulnerable to leaching. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about how we can minimize ammonia nitrogen volatilization from losses. So manures, urea, and UAN and other fertilizers, they all contain the ammonia form of nitrogen. And some of the recommended practices include dribbling instead of spraying the urea. It's a lot more efficient to kind of put it down. You could see this picture here where they have the drop down tubes, and they're just dragging those tubes on the ground to dribble the nitrogen out. That allows it to absorb better into the soil, and it's not being as exposed as much to the air and volatilizing. So you actually get more nitrogen that stays in the soil. Ideally, urea will be applied right before a rain event or irrigation. We really want to get that watered into the soil, or if we have the ability to inject the manure or the urea, that's great, or to incorporate. So pretty common now are the slow release urea formulations or the urease inhibitors as well, which are two different mechanisms to prevent that ammonia from volatilizing. So the slow release kind of have a coating on the fertilizer that help it to release more slowly and provide or allow for less of a risk of volatilization. And then the urease inhibitors is actually a chemical reaction that's preventing some of the enzymes from doing that conversion. So a couple of them on the market would be the agrotane and the limus. And there's other ones as well. If you'll get the slides, and there's a nice fact sheet about those. So then the next thing I wanted to talk about, so let me just back up and review for a second. So we've talked about the importance of timing to prevent the nitrate from being lost through leaching. And then we just talked about ways you could prevent the ammonium form of nitrogen to be lost through the volatilization. So there's different ways to prevent the ammonium to be lost through ammonia gas. And now we're going to talk about possible ways to prevent another way to prevent nitrate from leaching, but this one is trying to prevent the conversion of the ammonium form of nitrogen to nitrate. So you could see here how there's a bacterial reaction that converts the ammonium to nitrate called nitrification. And if we go here, so we could see that the ammonium, up to 55 pounds of nitrogen per day, can be converted by the bacteria to that nitrate form. The issue is that, so there's issues with both ammonium and nitrate. So you kind of have to think about all of these forms of nitrogen are leaky in some way. But the nitrate is soluble, and with the rain events, it's going to leach down through the soil and be lost. So there's the idea that maybe if we retain it in the ammonium form, that is not very mobile in the soil because it holds on to the negatively charged soil particles through cation exchange. So the ammonium has a positive charge. It is held onto the soil. And the nitrate has the negative charge, so that leaches down through the soil. So if we can retain the nitrogen in that positive state, that can also be taken up by plants. And the idea is that that will allow less nitrogen from being lost from the system. So the problem, so the nitrification, so the idea is that we're going to delay this nitrification process to retain more of the nitrogen as ammonium and less as nitrate, which is very soluble. This process is aerobic, it's acid sensitive. So if you have a low pH of your soil or a very acidic soil, you're not going to have the conversion from ammonium to nitrate. That is actually why if you're growing blueberries, you need to have an acidic soil, because blueberry plants can only use nitrogen in the ammonium form. They can't use the nitrate nitrogen. They don't have the enzyme in that plant to be able to utilize the nitrate. So they need to be able to take up nitrogen in the ammonium form. And therefore, if you have an acidic soil, that prevents this reaction from occurring, and it keeps all of the nitrogen in that ammonium form for the blueberry plants to take up. The process is also temperature sensitive, and it's dependent on those nitrifier bacteria populations. So again, that plays into the pH, because bacteria do not do well in an acidic soil. So that's why if the pH is too low, you're not going to have this bacteria process occurring. So the idea is that we could stop this process right here, maintain the ammonium. There are several nitrification inhibitors that are on the market. They're known by Conserve, Instinct. One is DCD or Centuro. And they can delay the conversion of ammonium by 2 to 6 weeks. They can be useful in very wet years where you're prone to a lot of leaching. They can be useful in very sandy soils or in poorly drained soils where you're going to have anaerobic conditions and you're going to have that nitrate being converted to N2 gas. However, the studies have shown very inconsistent profitability. Typically, because it's so dependent on the weather and it's really only helpful in very wet years, or dependent on the climate conditions, typically over the long run, it doesn't pay off to use these nitrification inhibitors. That's what the research has shown. Now we're going to talk about the denitrification. So that is, again, where the nitrate form is being converted to the N2 gas form. And this is an anaerobic process. So if you have a lot of flooding, like the opening photo where you saw the cornfield underwater, that is prime conditions for any nitrate to be denitrified and to be lost as N2 gas. You also need to have some kind of organic matter source, which there's plenty of out in the field, and then the source of nitrate and relatively warm temperatures. So it's not going to occur over the winter, but whenever the corn is growing, it can definitely occur. And here again, we see an area of nitrogen deficiency right in that low part of the cornfield where you're prone to the flooding condition. So we could assume here that this issue is occurring because it wasn't that not enough nitrogen was applied. It was because nitrogen was applied, the field got flooded for extended periods, and we lost that nitrogen as the N2 gas. So it's really complicated. And so wet conditions or rainfall can be good for retaining some forms of nitrogen, but then it can cause a loss of other forms of nitrogen. So for example, if we think about the forms that we've already talked about, if we have wet conditions, then denitrification losses are going to be greater. So the denitrification is the nitrate form being converted to the N2 gas in the anaerobic conditions or when the field is flooded. So those are going to be greater with rainfall. The ammonia volatilization, that's actually going to be less if we have rainfall. Because remember, if we apply fertilizers with the ammonium in it, and we water those in, or we irrigate those in, or incorporate them, then we have less risk that those are going to be lost and converted to the gas. Erosion, of course, is going to be greater with rainfall, and then leaching losses are going to be greater with rainfall. So it's really a balancing act about when we apply what types of, what different forms of nitrogen and how that interacts with the wetness or the irrigation or the rain. And then the elephant in the room, which I think we sometimes forget about, is that in reality, 98% of a typical soil is going to, the nitrogen is going to be organic. So if we have, say we have 2% nitrogen in the soil, so 98% of that is going to be in an organic form, and there's only going to be 2% in the inorganic nitrate and ammonium forms. So all of this other, so the 98% is going to be organic nitrogen. So if we go back to, it's going to be in this form right here, organic matter. It's going to be nitrogen hooked onto some kind of a carbon molecule. So 98% at any given time is going to be in this organic matter. It's going to be in an organic form. And then about 2% of that at any given time is going to be broken down into these mineral forms, which are taken up by the plant. So I mentioned that because we often will think about, oh, we have to apply all of the nitrogen we need to our plants, but we forget that there's this very large pool of organic nitrogen in the soil that is going to be breaking down over time. And that's going to be decomposing. So here you could see a leaf where it's partially decomposed, and that's going to be decomposing most of the year in our climate. So it's maybe a few weeks out in the winter where it's very cold and decomposition is very slow. But most of the year around here, at least you have periods where decomposition is occurring. And here's what I was talking about with, for example, the corn uptake. So in reality, if we look at the total nitrogen being taken up by corn, we have about that much from about 50 pounds per acre from the fertilizer, but at least another 50 to 100 pounds per acre is actually being taken up by those organic forms that have broken down during the corn growing season. So you could assume maybe 50 pounds are being taken up from the fertilizer that we applied, but there's a lot of nitrogen also being taken up that at the beginning of that growing season was still in the organic form, and it decomposed and released during the growing season. And so if we think, again, using corn as our model here, but this really does apply to a lot of other crops. If we think about the growing season of our crop, it may be actively taking up nitrogen from the soil for a month or two. The rest of the time, it's moving that nitrogen within the plant, or it's not taking up nitrogen at all, or the plant isn't even out there in the field, like over the winter period. So for most of the year, we do not have a crop actively taking up nitrogen, and that leaves a lot of opportunity for nitrogen to be lost. So I wanted to talk a bit here about some work that we did about 7 or 8 years ago, where we went around the region to see how much nitrogen actually remained following growing corn or soybean crop. And so this was samples from 29 fields in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and the samples went from the surface down to 7 feet deep. And on average, there was about 100, and mind you, this is after growing a corn or soybean crop. So after growing those crops, there was still about 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen and another 120 pounds per acre of ammonium in that soil profile. About half of that was in 0 to 3 feet deep, and the other half was in 3 to 7 feet deep. And it didn't matter whether you grew corn or soybean, you still had that big pool of residual nitrogen in the soil profile following that crop. So the orange line here is soybean. We actually found more residual nitrate in the, in the soil following a soybean crop that wasn't even fertilized. So that gets back to that idea that the nitrogen is always being mineralized, that organic nitrogen is always breaking down, even during the growing season where you have these continual pools of nitrate in the soil. That's where, and I'm going to move quickly here because we're almost out of time, but that's where cover crops can really come into play and are particularly important in our climate, where again, we have about 3 feet of leaching that occurs between the fall and the spring. So following our corn crop, if we do nothing, any nitrogen, or if we do not grow a cover crop, any nitrogen that's on the soil surface is going to be 3 feet deep by the following spring. That's money lost to our following cash crop that we could be retaining by recycling that nitrogen, but also it's harmful to the environment. The idea with the cover crops is that they're able to retain that nitrogen in the system. So they could take up that nitrogen before it's lost to leaching and then recycle that when they decompose to the following cash crop. And this is just a photo of a cover crop grown here in Maryland, the forage radish and crimson clover and triticale, which is the grass here. Triticale is a mix between wheat and rye. And then you can see that the cover crops are effective in our region at reducing the amount of nitrate both in the fall and in the spring. So if you look at these graphs, this is the soil depth from the surface down to 7 feet deep. And then across the x-axis here is the it's kilogram per hectare, but it's about equal to the pounds per acre of the nitrogen. And the black line is where there is no cover crop, and these other 3 lines are the different cover crops. So the radish is the orange, the winter cereal is the green, and then the mix, which is the radish plus the winter cereal plus a legume, typically is the blue. And so in the fall, you could see a lot more, and this is samples were taken in December typically. So after the fall cover crop growing season, a lot more nitrate on the upper layers of the soil where there's no cover crop than where there was the cover crops. And then if we jump to the spring, the graph is set up in the same way, surface of the soil down to 7 feet deep. But now we could see where the black line again, which is no cover crop, now we have a lot more nitrate all the way down to 7 feet deep where there's no cover crop. And all of the cover crops serve to reduce the amount of nitrate down deep. So again, that nitrate is now going to be more available. It's going to be taken up by the cover crops and released onto the soil surface, and it's not going to be lost via leaching. And this is a related study looking at the actual nitrate in the leaching water. And you could see here where all of these were the sampling dates across the bottom. And across the winter, February to April, all of the different cover crops they tried had a lot less nitrate in that leaching water than the no cover crop. And this is just showing how the kind of the end of the cycle. So not only are we preventing a nitrate from leaching away, but it is going to then decompose and help the following corn crop. So this was a trial in Clarksville, Maryland, where you could see after no cover crop versus after the radish cover crop, and then after the rye cover crop. So the thing to keep in mind with the winter cereal cover crops is that they have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, and they can cause that nitrogen to be immobilized or tied up, like we mentioned in the beginning, where the bacteria will eat that nitrogen and it won't be available to the crops. So thinking about the right type of cover crop, we want it to scavenge that nitrogen, the nitrate, and prevent it from leaching. But also, if we're following that cover crop by a crop that needs a lot of nitrogen, we may want to do the radish or mix to then release the nitrogen at that time. So just in conclusion, we want to remember the 4 principles of nutrient stewardship: right source, right rate, especially the right time in our region, and then the right place. And then also really important around here in our region is having something actively growing and taking up that nitrate for as long of a period as possible. So the winter cover crops are really effective around here to help cycle and prevent the loss of that nitrate. And I know that was a lot of information, so please ask questions, and then here's my information if you'd want to reach out for anything else. See if I could pull up the chat here. Does anybody have any questions?